Hello and welcome to this episode of Meet a Columban. I'm Fr Jim Mulroney and I'm your host, and my guest today is Fr Donal O'Keeffe. Now, Donal is a Columban from Ireland, and he arrived in South Korea back in 1973 and basically has been working in Korea ever since.
1976.
1976. I'm sorry to exaggerate there. But welcome, Donal. And I think you've been in Korea for a long time. We all recognise it from now back to 1976 is quite a long time. And you've seen terrific transition in the country. Mostly, I think what we know about South Korea in Australia today comes from television clips and maybe a few documentaries. And we see a well-developed country with a glittering capital city, good transport, well-dressed people. But life wasn't always like that. And I think when you first arrived in Korea, you walked into quite a different environment. So could you begin by telling us a little bit about what Korea was like in the days when you arrived?
I arrived in Korea in February 1976, and the middle of winter. So the first thing that really struck me was the cold. I'd never experienced such cold in my life. And strangely enough, there was no one at the airport to meet me when I arrived, because I'd come in from Los Angeles. And in those days, you sent a telegram ahead of time. But when they sent the telegram from the Columban House to Seoul, they actually specified, if it arrives within 24 hours, that's okay. But the telegram, I arrived within 15 hours, of course, of the flight. And I got out at the airport, and the airport, they thought I was an American soldier and put me into an army taxi and told me proceed. But anyway, I eventually found my way to the Columban House. And the second thing I noticed is when we got out of the car in front of the Columban House, like children everywhere. Even though it was winter time, they were just running around the streets. And the following days, walking around our area, that really, stuck with me. More so, it's a huge contrast with today. 45 years later, it's very, very difficult to see children here, First of all, I think families have got smaller. Secondly, the pressure to start studying when you're very young means there's no one out playing. But to get back to when I arrived, meeting the Columbans, and within a week, then one of the lads invited me out to the parish, and we went out to a rural parish in Gangwon-do, and no hard surfaced roads, and we were in a jeep, and the whole thing was freezing weather and snow, and oh God, we went then to the parish hall and the church, and this big wooden fire, you could say, inside in the barrel, trying to heat the people and heat the place. But those were early memories, of the my first days in Korea.
I remember one of the first things I visited Korea around about that time. And one thing that struck me was that there was really only a few things on display in shops. There seemed to be a great shortage of stock. And yet when I went there a second time, about 10 years later, the shops had so much stock, they couldn't fit it all inside. It was spilling out onto the streets. So somewhere in that 10 years, economically, there'd been a great step forward made. And obviously people had a lot more money to be able to, consume, to go shopping and buy things. So what did you see happening in the 10 years between about 1976 and 1986?
Well, the government at the time was led by President Park Chung-hee, and he'd come to power in 1961, and he immediately put into place what he called 5-year economic plans. And the basis of the whole plan was to turn Korea from being an agriculturally based rural community into an industrial based urban society, which would be exporting. And to do that, two things were necessary. Essentially cheap labor. So he actually depressed the agricultural sector, forced people off the land. They all came into cities looking for jobs. And all the big international corporations came in and set up factories because there was an abundance of labor. And because he had depressed the agricultural prices, there was cheap food available. So over a period of 20 years, Korea suddenly became a kind of factory-based, young workers earning wages and going out and spending, of course, and exporting country. And that really changed the face of Korea very, very rapidly. And, when you had all these young people into cities, even though they worked long hours, they got married, they had families, and you had to have all the shops began to follow them. And then people came in and set up their own little businesses on the side of the streets. So it really, everything began to change very rapidly in Korea at that time.
Now, during that time, you became involved with young factory workers and young people who were migrating in from the countryside and from the rural areas into the cities to work. And they faced quite a lot of difficulties at the time.
That's right.
There were problems with labour rights, there were problems with unsafe working conditions in factories. And you became quite involved with these people. What type of work or what type of approach were you taking at that time?
Well, one of the difficulties was Park Chung-hee, like the president, in his initial, you could say, almost 10 years, people were very, they saw the concrete results and the country changing and the people had work. But as time went on, he became, changed from being, I suppose, benevolent into being a kind of a despotic dictator. And he was really focused on building this economy. So he would not allow any type of worker organization. I mean, workers worked huge long hours, one rest day a month, I should say. And then an awful lot of them who came in from the countryside were just out of middle school, even if they had graduated from there. And in this country, like where education is very highly rated because of Confucius, those young people, often felt a sense of inferiority and they didn't have great confidence and they worked long hours, so they were tired. And then they could gather nowhere because Park Chung-hee, banned unions, banned public meetings, basically. Anything that kind of might suggest people gathering together. So the only place they could gather was in space provided by the church. And what we did then was, I was appointed to Incheon Diocese together with Sacred Heart Sisters and some, very, I suppose, aware JOC or YCW graduates. We actually got a house, an ordinary family house, and I lived there. And we opened it up so workers could come in, and we always provided a meal. And I was just there to chat with people, and we got to know them, and asking what their interests, what they would like. And out of that came various small groups. Like if a group were interested in music, we provided a kind of someone who would come in and teach them. If they were interested in, on their one day a month going to climb the mountains, we formed kind of a trekking team. Or if they were interested in labour law, asked someone to come in and, talk about it and teach it. But more especially, we got this education program to build confidence. 2 nights a week where they just came in and through simple group dynamics, talk about themselves, make friends where they met their peers. And actually, even though it was only a 5-week program, people got they literally changed. I can still recall, like 15, 14, 16, 17-year-olds, very, very shy, but getting into this group. And after 4 weeks, they had friends, they talked, they laughed. And they said, we want to continue meeting in small groups. So our purpose was to form all these little small groups and let them do as they wish afterwards, That was the basic approach. So the majority, of course, people who were coming weren't Catholics at all or Christian. But if they were, we always tried. We had a mass on a a Thursday evening for Catholics. And the whole idea was to try and help them to understand their faith in a way that would help them to, be happy as workers. What's the invitation to me as a worker if I'm a Christian, a follower of Jesus? So instead of homilies, we used to just divide them into a small little group of 3 or 4 and give a question about the gospel. And on Sundays then, I didn't have any mass. I used to just go to the mountains with different groups. We start to set the Thursday evening mass as the weekly gathering of the small Christian community, insofar as we had a Christian community. So over the years, I was there from 80 to 89, and the country the democratic movement began to grow on the 85, 86, 87, and an awful lot of the young people that went through these programs became Labour leaders. And of course, I wasn't alone in doing this work. In other dioceses, there were other people with similar approaches, and we actually formed a kind of a national organisation. And the church in that period had a huge impact in the democratic process, the democratization of Korea, I would think, in hindsight,
I think that's quite an achievement, because Korea is arguably one of only the 2 countries in Asia which really has transitioned from being an extremely oppressive society to a truly democratic society, where there are strong institutions that are not controlled by government figures. And the society that we see in Korea today is a radically different one from the one that you were describing there. But nevertheless, there's still a society which is not devoid of problems. And in more recent times, I think you've been involved with people being ousted from homes, people who are renting in homes being ousted with nowhere to go. And what was happening during that period?
Well, with the democratic, transition started really at the end of the 1980s. I think the 1988 Olympics was a very watershed year in Korea, and it led to there was actually the first election of the president by direct vote of the people. And then by 1997 or 8, the former, so to speak, dissident leaders became presidential candidates and became president. So that kind of really cemented the democratic change in Korea. But and of course, what had happened, NGOs, residence groups, and environmental groups more recently, but all these issue groups were able to kind of bloom and take their place. Whereas originally you had just the president and the government and individual citizens, you now had the intervening groups. So the church could actually, move back. And at that stage, during the 90s, I was involved with, rentees. What you had there was, I suppose, you still have the powerful are the powerful and the weak are the weak, even in democratic societies, and they use their power. And what was happening at that stage is, even though the development projects being brought about in the cities were excluding the rentees, it was the property owners who had rented the houses, and the government and the city got together and said, we will redevelop. You'd have just a lot of, particularly around the outskirts, these one-story shacks. We would build skyscrapers here and make a lot of money. But to do that, we need to move the rentees out. So rentees then formed an organization, or tried to, where there was space to do it. But in accompanying them, the role of the church then was to, show solidarity with groups who were struggling. They had their own space, they were doing their own organization, but while being part of the meetings, help them to, you're an individual rentee, but you're part of this community. What does that mean in terms of, balancing my own desires, my own wishes, my own rights with the wider rights of the community, like the common good, which is a huge Christian or Catholic tradition, bringing in values like that and helping the people to, how can they work together more as a community? Like And then again, like as I did with the during the 80s with workers, with the 90s with the Catholic owners or our rentees and the people who are active, again helping them to articulate their struggle and their faith, and in terms of their faith, so that their faith would actually empower them to get more involved in building a kind of a more just and a more equitable society. It was at that level then, more one step back from direct involvement, but accompanying the people. And of course, the Columbans, of course, during all this period were changing radically. When I came to Korea initially, I always remember this because we had a chapter, this annual general meeting, or this general meeting of the society, which happens every 6 years. And we had 121 people in Korea at that stage. Majority were working in parishes. And today, actually, I just checked before we started this, we have 21 priests here, 1 lay missionary, and we have a number, of course, student members. But at that stage, we were involved mostly in parishes because the local church was weak. But today, this is just 40 years later, we just have 1 parish. The majority of the guys are working in what we call, extra parochial apostolates. Particularly in more recent years, the whole peace movement has been very very important in Korea, because the Korean Peninsula is one of the most heavily armed areas in the world. But there has been a change over the years as the local church took over the parishes. We moved into new areas of the apostolate. For example, I went into workers that time. Other guys began to work with students, like CPE, Catholic Pastoral Education, and clinical pastoral education, working with people with special needs, counseling, spiritual direction, retroville, working with married couples. More recently, working with multicultural families, migrant workers, because as Korea changed and the people had greater, so to speak, expectations, they no longer were keen to do what we would call the more basic, work-orientated, labor-orientated tasks in the society. And so migrant workers began to come into Korea, particularly in the late 90s and more so in the last 20 years. So you have people from all over the world. So the church began to reach out to them. And since we were already, I suppose, migrants, you could say, we had an affinity with them. And so Columbans began to work with those people as well,
Well, you've certainly been there during a time when many changes have taken place. And we thank you, Donald, for giving us your time today and sharing of your rich experience of living and working in South Korea with us. And before leaving, it would be derelict not to mention that you were decorated recently by the Korean government as Migrant of the Year. And so we congratulate you on the honour that you have received. But I'm sure it's an honour that you received on behalf of the many Columbans that worked with you and worked alongside you, and other people that have worked with you as well. So congratulations and thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim.
Keep on working hard.
Well, thank you. Yeah. Regards to everyone.
We've been talking with Donal O'Keeffe in Korea. He's been our guest today on this episode of Meet a Columban. I'm Jim Mulroney.